The Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project is supported in part by funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Achieving self-governance is a unique process for each nation. It's based on their traditions, history, present circumstances, and their needs for the future. But there are some common issues, as we've been exploring in the last 9 episodes. It's also a dynamic process, which means the journey and the learning will never be quite finished, and there will always be more questions to answer. Hello, and welcome to Inherent Rights, Informed Voices, a podcast brought to you by the Centre for First Nations Governance and the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project. My name is Catherine MacQuarrie. I'm Project Manager for RFNG, and I'll be your host for today. Today we have a special Q&A episode. As I hope you know by now, we've been working with the Centre for First Nations Governance and our First Nations partners over the last 6 years. We're supporting them in their journey to self-government and learning from them along the way. We wanted to end this series by hearing your voice and answering your questions. In this special Q&A episode, we've collected the questions we've received about First Nations' inherent right to self-government from across Canada, and we've turned to our team of specialists from across the country who can answer them. We are very lucky to have Douglas Sanderson, Amo Benashi. He's Swampy Cree Beaver Clan of the Pascagoyak Cree Nation. He's a lawyer, law professor, and Fulbright scholar. He's a frequent contributor to Policy Options and Global Brief, and has served as a senior policy advisor to the Government of Ontario in the offices of the Attorney General and Aboriginal Affairs.
I had a question about self-government. There's a lot of big words that people use in self-government that are confusing. For example, what's the difference between self-government and self-governance, or Indigenous law and Indigenous jurisdiction? And the last one is Aboriginal law versus Indigenous law. Thank you.
So how do you want to tackle these 3 common terms, but I have to agree are often quite confusing for people?
Sure. Well, thanks, Catherine. Thanks for having me. Thanks for that very warm and generous introduction. And I think maybe it might be easiest to work backwards on the questions, because I think they start theoretical and become technical. And maybe let's do the technical part and then move to what feels to me more theoretical. So first, Aboriginal versus Indigenous law. There is not a hard distinction set out anywhere in legislation that tells us the difference between these two terms. But in practice, we lawyers and law professors have tended to categorize Aboriginal law as being law about Aboriginal people. So these would be sections of the Constitution. These would be statutes about Aboriginal people. This would be judge-made law within the common law and civil law system about Aboriginal peoples. Right? So that's law that affects Indian, Inuit, and Métis peoples. That's Aboriginal law. Indigenous law, we've increasingly been using to refer specifically to the laws of Indigenous nations themselves. So there we're really trying to talk about Cree legal orders or Anishinaabe legal orders or Saulteaux or Métis law. And so the difference between Aboriginal law and Indigenous law is sort of an inside-outside difference. Aboriginal law is outside law that affects First Nations, Inuit and Métis communities. Indigenous law is the law of those communities that interacts with the larger Canadian legal order.
That's great. And then in terms of self-government, though, I think what I heard was very specifically the term Aboriginal, because it's in the Constitution and it is defined, and it defines particular peoples. That is, there is a legal preciseness to using Aboriginal law as a term. Yeah.
Maybe Indigenous law versus jurisdiction. And I think there, I mean, we don't really need to talk about the Indigenous part at all. What we need to talk about is the distinction between law and jurisdiction more broadly. So law is the set of rules that fills in the space within a particular territory, or what in law we call a jurisdiction. And different levels of government can have jurisdiction over the same physical space. So, for example, while you're in British Columbia, you might be subject to municipal law around zoning, but also provincial law with respect to the speed limits, but also federal law with respect to banking and the post office, for example. And so all three orders of government have a jurisdiction over a space. And so when we talk about Indigenous law and Indigenous jurisdiction, really just what we're talking about is thinking about First Nations peoples, Métis and Inuit peoples, as having a legal order that has jurisdictional space within a territory. And it doesn't necessarily exclude other areas of law. A great deal of Canadian constitutional law is devoted to figuring out, in areas where the federal and provincial governments have overlapping jurisdiction, which one of them prevails with respect to any particular issue. And so when we talk about Indigenous jurisdiction, we're talking about thinking of a First Nations or an Inuit or a Métis government as having exclusive legal authority that may bump up and come into conflict with federal and provincial law. But we have a variety of constitutional tools for thinking about which of those orders of government should have jurisdiction over this particular event. So, for example, we could imagine something like fisheries in some waters. The province might have some jurisdiction over it because it's an inland river. Though a First Nation might have jurisdiction over it because they're the ones who have been using and utilizing that resource for 1,000 years. And then we can imagine the federal government also might have an interest in, say, conservation as a federal area of matter. And so, but while all three of these jurisdictions overlap, we do have tools available to us to figure out which one should be the one that actually governs. And so we might imagine that a First Nation, as long as they were exercising conservation in their responsible fishing, then there would be no federal interest. But if it turned out that the fishers were using nets or lines of a line length that threatened the salmon stock, then the federal government might have an interest to come in and say, no, in the goodness of all Canadians' interests, we're going to impose these regulations. So jurisdiction is about who has the say over it, and law is about what gets said within those spaces. And different orders of government can have overlapping jurisdiction within a place.
Just a question that occurs to me, in order to exercise jurisdiction, there has to be lawmaking, does there not? So even while a government, including an Aboriginal government, may have the jurisdiction notionally over a matter, it really doesn't come into effect until they've actually crafted or somehow expressed the law that they wish to have asserted over that area. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. And there's different ways that can happen. One way is for the court just to tell us that that's the case. So, for example, the Chilcotin people of central British Columbia went to the Supreme Court after going through all the other courts to have the court declare that the Chilcotin had Aboriginal title over this area of land. And so once that court case was decided, neither the federal or provincial governments had to do anything because the court just told us that's what the law was there. A different example might be something like the agreement between the BC government and the Haida Gwaii Nation over northern Vancouver Island, where they simply agreed that the Haida Gwaii would have jurisdiction over the private property interests within Haida Gwaii. And it can also arise as a result of a long-term negotiation that settles an existing land claim. So, for example, the Tsawwassen First Nation, the Nishka First Nation, have entered into treaty with the federal and provincial governments. And part of those negotiations are actually about sorting out who has jurisdiction within that Nishka territory over those areas of law. And so the Nishka final agreement that was signed by the Nishka government, the federal government, and the province of British Columbia transfers jurisdiction of fisheries to the Nishka-Liam's government, transfers control over fish or forestry and the regulation of forestry from the provincial government to the Nishka-Liam government. I should say the fishery, there's a federal component because the feds have jurisdiction over oceans. And so federal government transferred jurisdiction over oceans within the territory to the Nishka, and the province transferred over jurisdiction of the salmon while they're in the riverways themselves. And so there does have to be some kind of recognition that we're all going to agree that these will be the laws of this area. And that can be accomplished either through negotiation resulting from a legal claim, or negotiation resulting from the parties deciding to work things out, or through a court order as a result of a legal claim against one or the other orders of government. Yeah. There is something more to be said here, and I think that it is... I think that increasingly what we want to see happening are Aboriginal nations asserting their own law, and the way that I would like to see people do that is to work with lawyers and political theorists to try and write down, like, what are the laws of the Nishka Nation with respect to, say, a fishery or towards forestry. And because in instances where there are communities with traditional territories that are not recognized by one agreement or a law or a court case or any other, federal and provincial governments tend to act as though those areas are without law. And so they simply impose their jurisdiction over those spaces. Whereas instead, it would be much better if the communities themselves had written out their codes of laws with respect to these issues. So when the federal and provincial government came along and said, oh, we're going to dam this river, or you need to move to this other place, our communities can respond by saying, we can't do that. It's against our law. And then those two sets of laws have to interact with one another. And that begins to give life to this indigenous legal order. But I think for too long, we've lived in a world where we didn't want to translate our oral traditions into written laws because that changes things, and it does change things. But the world has changed, and now we need a way of putting our laws into the public space to allow them to interact with federal and provincial law so that we can carve out a space for ourselves. Otherwise, what happens is we just have to fight against the imposition of federal and provincial jurisdiction. And so, meeting that challenge, like, it's no longer enough that all this is stored in Uncle Joe's head. Like, it's time that we actually went, talked to Uncle Joe, got the stories, figured out how to write out the code of laws so that it can interact with other laws, and in so doing be given a life.
I'm glad you broke in and added that additional context or information, Douglas. That it is significant. It's the point of what we're doing as part of the Rebuilding First Nations Governance project with the Centre for First Nations Governance. It's the hard job of the practical exercise of sovereignty is actually lawmaking and codifying codifying your laws so that others can interact with it. Great.
Yeah, and we need to start waiting for a legal battle to come along before we try and fill it in. We should start filling that space in on our own in anticipation of its interaction.
Yeah. I think a lot of people feel they need to wait for permission to do that, though.
Yeah, I think that is true, and I think that one of the trends that we have seen is the beginning of the development for many First Nations developing constitutions of their own, which I was, for many years I was very skeptical about, but now I see that as it's a starting place for thinking about this operation of laws. It's a starting place it's figuring out what are the overarching governing principles of our legal order, and then we can begin to find instances of that law with respect to fisheries or forestry or education or child welfare. And so increasingly communities beginning with that constitution building exercise, I think is an important way of instantiating our law in the public sphere.
If I can just put in a plug for RFNG at this point, we do actually have a couple of examples. Interestingly, they're both fisheries examples, one in Listagouche and another at Nipissing, where the nations there drafted their own laws around fishing in order to be able to manage certain dire circumstances that were happening on the ground. And there are little short case studies on our website, but they're both very interesting because they did wind up in one case, in the Listagouche case, with the federal government, and in Ontario with the provincial government recognizing their law and in fact helping them to implement it and helping to enforce those laws. So it can work out really well. So the final one, which you said was a little bit more theoretical, the difference between self-government and self-governance.
Yeah, so it's not the difference between government and governance that is my concern. My concern is with the self part. And I don't like to talk about self-government or self-governance, and I say that because I don't know what it is. I know what governance is, and I know what a government is. By including the word self, it feels to me like we are signaling to the rest of the Canadian legal order that this is not a real thing. This is a diminished version of what provinces or the federal government or municipalities get to exercise. They get to govern. And we get some diminished form of that known as self-government. And so I think that when we lose the self part and we just start talking about Aboriginal governance of our communities, we begin that process of interaction of our laws with the laws of the federal and provincial and municipal governments. And what we are asserting in saying that is that our law is valid, that it is useful, that it helps to resolve the real issues of living people, and that it can interact with other legal orders to achieve those same ends. And I think of it as a real sort of linguistic cue that lawmakers, lawyers, politicians, social theorists don't take this seriously, because the thing that I'm talking about, you don't have to worry about it. It's not a scary thing to you because we've already sort of capped it at this limited form. And I want to assert Aboriginal rights of governance for our communities, not a diminished form, which is taken as a token gift. I want our assertions to come from our communities, from our laws, from ourselves, but that what we are asserting is a form of government equal to other orders of government.
You raise a really good point. My experience and work in this area goes back several decades. And I think, self-government arose out of a backlash against being governed by a colonial power, by the Canadian government through the Indian Act. And it was a way to say, we intend to govern ourselves. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Douglas.
Thank you so much, Catherine.
Loved your insights. Dr. Mason Ducharme is from Nilwat Nation. He serves as Executive Director at the Centre for First Nations Governance, known as CFNG, And in addition to his role at CFNG, he serves as the National Community Research Director for RFNG, our project. In his work, Mason has been involved in many community-based conversations about the Indian Act and the inherent right to self-government. So we thought he'd be the perfect person to answer this question.
What is holding some of our nations back from becoming self-governing? Why do we remain stuck under the Indian Act?
That's a good question, and I can't help but think of a story to kind of answer it. So this is called The Elephant and the Rope Story. A man walking past an elephant enclosure noticed that these massive, incredibly powerful creatures were being held in place by only a small, thin rope tied to their front legs. There were no heavy chains and there were no cages. Curious as to why such a gigantic, strong animals didn't snap the rope and walk away, the man asked a trainer nearby for an explanation. The trainer smiled and explained, "When they are very young and much smaller, we use the exact same size rope to tie them. At that age, the rope is strong enough to hold them. When they try to pull away and escape, they fail because they aren't strong enough yet. So they learn that the rope is more powerful than they are. As the elephants grew into massive adults, their strength increased exponentially, making it effortless to break the rope. However, because they were conditioned to believe that they could not break free when they were babies, they never even tried." So you might be wondering, why am I sharing a story about elephants when we're talking about why some communities are struggling to move out of the Indian Act? Well, to make it better understood, I always think about how the Indian Act is this piece of rope. And this Indian Act was applied to us 150 years ago. And it was meant to really take away our governing practices, our responsibilities to our people, to really make us dependent on it. You know, I think about what Satsang says sometimes is this piece of legislation started off not just about assimilation, but termination. So it was a tool to really control us like this rope. What our people don't understand is that we grew, and we grew to do what our ancestors fought for. So you look at the inclusion of Section 35 into the Canadian Constitution in 1982, and then you look at all this other Indigenous case law that has happened for the past decades. You've got Delgamuukw, Stay Away, you've got the Nashkawa, you've got the Haida, you've got the Shulkotin. We are now big elephants. And we still have this tiny piece of rope called the Indian Act. And we're facing this thing that I coin as Indian Act paralysis, where we're afraid to move out of the Indian Act. And that fear is real. I go to many communities, and one of the first things people say they're afraid about self-government is losing their status card. Like, that's very colonial, that status card. But there's that tie to it. There's that fear of the unknown. People don't know what self-government can look like outside of the treaty process. You know, I think back to conversations I've had with many people, and they say that's what the biggest barrier to self-government is ourselves. It's our mindset. You know, I think to one of my mentors, the late Ray Pierre, and he'd say, "We just got to do it. Let's go just get something done. Let's do something we're proud of for our next generation." But I think as a result of his Indian Act and the fear it's caused, it's also caused a lot of divisiveness in our community that comes out as a form of lateral violence to one another. And I think back to my friend and my elder, Counselor Scotty Holmes, and he always says we need to learn to love each other again. So I think that's what we have to do, is we got to look at healing this trauma that the Indian Act has done and breaking free from this rope that the Indian Act has on us. Our inherent rights are recognized and affirmed. We have a full box of rights under Section 35. We can start to do something. And if you look at the current state of Canada and the world right now, we have a responsibility to start to do something. Otherwise, our future generations are going to suffer for our lack of action and implementation. The time is now. Let's be the brave, strong elephants and break out of this tiny rope. Neath tea.
Thank you very much, Mason. What a great analogy, the elephants feeling like they were still all tied up, and that's what kept them constrained. I hope we can all, as you suggest, realize that we don't have to live with those ropes around our legs anymore. Muscantquet, also known as Dwayne Nashkawa, is a member of the Chippewas of Saugeen First Nation, and he spent his career working exclusively in First Nations in senior roles in the areas of natural resources, treaty research, governance, and administration. And Dwayne is currently governance director at MacQuarrie, the administrative body that's responsible for guiding, supporting, and encouraging 8 First Nations as they transition from Indian Act governance to First Nations governance under the Anishinaabe Nation Governance Agreement Act. So we're really lucky to have Dwayne. He's going to be a perfect person to answer this next question, and I know that because we've been lucky to have him working with us at RFNG for the last number of years as a key collaborator.
Why do people think self-government is a good thing? I don't always like what Chief and Council do, but how would self-government be any different?
You know, what I often hear is that people have a hard time imagining that, really things would be any different. And, I know you spend a lot of time at one First Nation helping them through some, major development over the years. So I think you do have a perspective on what could be different, leaving the Indian Act behind and becoming a nation government. But is it possible for you to maybe talk about what some of those differences are in a way that the average person could maybe feel it or see it or touch it?
We have to really be expansive in our thinking here and really think about the opportunity in front of us. Like, what does it mean to govern in our own way? We don't have to have elections every 2 years. We don't have to follow, these prescriptions under the Indian Act to engage in leadership selection. We can do this entirely our own way. And that doesn't mean reverting to systems of the past entirely. I don't know that it's something we can do in a modern context anyway, easily. But we can move in those directions and start to embed activities and ways of thinking into the way we organize leadership selection, right? So I'll give you an example. At Nipissing First Nation, where I used to work as the CEO, when new leadership was elected in the community, they would have their first meeting and they'd take some pictures and they would maybe recite an oath of office. The most recent election, the election still happened, but it wasn't just a reciting of an oath of office. When the leadership started its mandate, the lodge was built by the community, right? And then once the lodge was built, there was ceremony to welcome the new leaders into this role. And it really conveyed from the start a different approach to governing than had been typical in the past, right? It was a rather complete break from the old ways of doing it, which was sort of very kind of paper oriented. And this had been a process over many years of moving away from that prescribed process to one that was steeped in ceremony.
I can see, and in the example that you gave, that what it does, particularly bringing ceremony in that way, is also change the relationship of leadership to people, the reciprocity of responsibility, in a way that the Indian Act system just never captured.
Oh, definitely.
So when our questioner says, why would self-government be any different? What I'm hearing you say, Dwayne, is it will be different because we will make it different.
Precisely, right? This is going to be our way of doing things. And one of the great challenges with it is we've been so conditioned to think in a certain way that when I put the question to people often, well, what do you see governance looking like here? Sometimes in the early going of these conversations, it's very reflective of Indian Act style governance, on reserve, off reserve, these dynamics that we've been dealing with for so long. And, these effects the act has had on our own people, and so there's a lot of that kind of healing work that goes along with this governance work, right? And so that's why we take an approach of supporting and guiding. This is not a prescriptive process. It's got to, the best definition of culture I ever heard from a friend of mine was, it's just the way we do things around here, and so that's what it's got to reflect. It's got to reflect the way you do things around and the way you want to see things done, and the community's vision for the future. So I think that's what I sort of carry with me when I do this work.
I know I'm grateful for all the work that you do, Dwayne, and I'm sure your community is too, thank goodness. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
I'm so happy to do this, and I've really enjoyed becoming friends with you and everybody else through this process. So I'm very grateful to be able to do my bit here too.
So our next question is all about the money, and we're very lucky to have Frances Abele, Distinguished Research Professor and Chancellor's Professor Emerita in the School of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton University. She's also co-director with Sasa and Herb George of the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project. So Frances, people often ask in community level conversations, or I should say maybe it's more that they express concern that if they become self-governing, they will lose their special relationship with the federal government, and more importantly, will lose important financial resources to run their communities and for individuals. So this next question that came to us is,
if we're not under the Indian Act anymore, where will our communities get money to function and provide essential services to our citizens? What are other ways nations can fund themselves to be self-sufficient?
The funding that now comes to First Nation governments is funding they are entitled to, whether or not they're under the Indian Act. So it would be reasonable to expect that when a nation leaves the Indian Act, the transfer payments that they now receive for infrastructure and other things will continue. So like any other government in Canada, like a city government or a province, the new governments, Section 35 governments, will be entitled to receive transfers from the federal government. We know that for years and years and years, First Nation band council governments have been underfunded. And so I think with the establishment of Section 35 governments, we're going to look for more funding for those governments, something like that would be equal to what other governments receive on a per capita basis. That's the first thing. The second thing is some of them will have own source revenues. Some do already. And so that money could be used directly on things that are necessary, or it could go into funds to be used for business development and other things. They would be entitled to charge a business tax or royalties on their land for the development of it. So there are, they will have the same source of revenue as other governments in Canada. And once freed of the Indian Act, they won't have to answer for those transfers in the same way they do now. One example is think about contribution agreements. There might still be some, but which contribution agreements come with a lot of strings. There might still be some of those for special purposes, but as a general routine measure, that money that now comes as a contribution agreement would be just transferred to the nation to use as it sees fit.
Thanks, Francis. You've referred a few times to Section 35 governments, and I just want to be clear there that you're distinguishing between bank councils set up under the Indian Act and self-governments that would be established under Section 35 of the Constitution that recognizes Aboriginal and treaty rights. Am I correct?
Exactly correct.
So it sounds like at a sort of a community or nation level, things would be fine. But I know often these questions mask a personal concern that a lot of people have, that very important social programs and services, whether it's for post-secondary education or health services that individuals really rely on, might disappear under self-government. Are people right to be worried about that?
I understand the reason for that concern, and it's very important to get that clear. But it's not the Indian Act that produces those transfers, that creates the program that provides medical benefits, for example, for people. That is an artifact of the treaties. And then federal policy that it's not, the medicine chest is not mentioned in every treaty, but the decision was made a long time ago by the Crown that all of the treaty nations were entitled to the medicine chest. And in fact, all registered Indians are entitled to the medical benefits. That won't disappear with the end of the Indian Act. That obligation still exists. Federal policy can change, and sometimes it's possible to challenge a policy change in the court system, but that takes a long time. So it's always important to make explicit as much as possible what the conditions will be for the establishment of a new government, what its relationship will be, the Section 35 government relationship will be with the federal government. And that will require negotiation, and it will require writing it down because policy can change.
Now, some of the nations across the country are not necessarily under treaty. Would they have to be concerned? Or I believe you've mentioned in the past that even though the medicine chest, for example, was established under the numbered treaties, it applies across the country. A choice was made to apply it across the country. Is that correct?
Yes, so they will have control over their own money, period. And at the moment, there are, different degrees of control that are exercised depending on, whether the nation has been in third-party management and so on. But it's always the Indian Affairs bureaucracy that has the ultimate control over an Indian Act nation's funds. Now that's been modified in recent years, and the control's been loosened up. There are all sorts of different arrangements. But for Section 35 governments, that's the point of it. They will end up being governments of their own people, and they set their own priorities, manage their own funding. But it's important to notice or to remember that the transfer shouldn't stop. The money should still move to the nation because they're citizens of Canada like everybody else. And just as the city of Ottawa receives funding from the province and from the federal government for certain kinds of infrastructure, the Section 35 nation governments should receive similar funding on an equitable per capita basis.
Thank you, Frances. Thanks for clearing up something that I know is deeply on people's minds when they're having these hard conversations about making big changes in their communities.
Well, it's very important that when people are planning the route out from the Indian Act, that they make sure that they confirm all of what I said prevails, confirm that the health benefits will continue and other things. It's not the sort of thing I would leave to goodwill. It has to get it. They should get it in writing. You're welcome.
Good advice. Thanks, Frances. Chris is Gitscan and has worked for several decades in a whole wide variety of areas: community economic and organizational development, professional management, public communications, strategic planning, governance. He has supported First Nation communities, governments, and businesses across the country, and he's also worked alongside SATSAN on many inherent right initiatives. And he's also one of our project collaborators.
How can we educate our people, especially our youth, to collaborate on a nation level in implementing Section 35 and understand there's so much more than Indian Act band systems?
So to answer this question, we asked Chris Robertson. Unfortunately, Chris was only able to provide us with a written response, so just changing things up a little bit, and I've asked our producer, Emma Fazakas, to join me to read Chris's response. Hey, Emma, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. It's kind of fun getting to see the other side of things.
Yeah, you've been on the quiet end of all of these interviews. It's great to have your voice. So, what did Chris respond for that very sophisticated and lengthy question? How can we educate our people and help people understand there's so much more than Indian Act band systems?
Yeah, so Chris gave us a great response. He said that a lot of Indigenous citizens and youth actually grow up seeing governance primarily through what he calls the Banned Indian Act system, or bias, and that's things like chiefs, councils, band managers, programs, elections, memberships, et cetera, et cetera. And so these are things that focus on the federal government as the primary source of the band support. Chris says bias was designed to eliminate successful governance and economic systems that conflicted and contradicted the economic ideology of rampant exploitation under a capitalist system. So, Indigenous ancestors spent thousands of years modeling and investing their observations in trial and error and designing economic and governing systems that not only exploited resources without consequence to the land and environment, but it also enhanced those resources to enormous benefit of their nations. So to dismantle something like bias and restore nationhood, there needs to be a lot of collaboration between villages that would have historically been connected as nations. And so Chris gave a great outline of some things that can help to push that. He said that clearly identifying and dismantling the barriers that keep people and their communities separated from each other within their nations can be a great help, as well as creating opportunities for youth and all citizens to connect beyond the reserve boundaries. Hosting things like gatherings and feasts that include inviting all the associated villages is a great help, or organizing culture camps for youth and the families, or organizing governance and leadership camps is also a great help. Land-based learning is super important, and that language learning emphasizes and strengthens concepts that English just isn't able to. Mentorship opportunities with hereditary and selected leaders is great. And last but not least, that returning to traditional criteria for vetting and selecting leadership can be really helpful, whether it's through hereditary means or by consensus. So essentially by recentering traditional governance teachings like Indigenous law, kinship systems, stewardship, responsibilities, and nation history, all of these things can really help youth and citizens understand that self-government under Section 35 isn't just about the res and chief and council, but it's also about reclaiming everybody's Indigenous jurisdiction, identity, and responsibility.
So thank you very much, Emma, for reading Chris's response, and thank you to Chris, wherever you are, for such a deep response. David Newhouse is Onondaga from the Six Nations of the Grand River community near Brantford, Ontario, and Professor Emeritus, Indigenous Studies at Trent University. His research interests are focused on the way in which Aboriginal traditional thought and Western thought are coming together and creating modern Aboriginal societies.
What does self-government look like for urban Indigenous communities? Do they face unique challenges in achieving self-government?
Hello, David. Thank you so much for agreeing to answer this question for us.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. It's good to see you. It's good to talk with you as well.
So, urban Indigenous communities and self-government, this is something that you've been studying and following for several decades now. How would you answer this question?
Well, I want to start by talking about two incidents that provide a foundation for how we begin to think about urban Indigenous communities, right? I should say I've been involved with French Center movement since 1978, either as a president of a Friendship Center, a member of a board of a Friendship Center, a member of the executive of the Ontario Federation of what used to be Indian Friendship Centers, now Indigenous Friendship Centers, and then the treasurer for the National Association of Friendship Centers. So I've been involved in the urban community for close to 40 years. In 1999, we hosted a AGM in Ottawa, and we invited the national chief to come to speak to us. We were interested as a national association of creating an alliance with the Assembly of First Nations, of trying to find a way to advance shared interest, particularly around urban populations. And so the national chief got up on stage and we asked him the question, and he said, why would we work with you? Because you have left your communities, you've abandoned your communities, you've turned your back on us. Why would we work with you? Right? And that's the way in which I think many Indigenous leaders see urban Indigenous people who live in urban centers, as having abandoned their communities, as having turned their back on their neighbors, upon their friends, upon their family, and left their communities. So why should we work with you? And that's the first thing. The second thing is I am a member of the advisory committee here in Peterborough that is looking at the city plan, the official city plan. Right? And I looked at the consultation strategy that the city had set out. And their consultation strategy focused upon the local First Nations in our area, Hiawatha, Curve Lake, and Alderville. And they only spoke of those two communities, or those three communities. And so I asked the question, why are there no urban Indigenous institutions, leaders here at the table, right? We live in the city, we pay taxes, we have been here for a long time, and we're part of the fabric of the city of Peterborough. There wasn't a good answer to that question, right? But the municipal leaders, right, see Indians as living on reserve. Our local MP, right, when he was running for election, refused to come to a all candidates meeting that we held that was sponsored by the Friendship Center. And I asked him, I said, why aren't you coming? He said, I've already done outreach to cultural communities. And I said, where did you go? And he said, I went to Curve Lake. So I said, there are 6,000 of us living in the city. More than 50% are over the age of 18 and eligible to vote. There are 3,000 votes. On Curve Lake, there are 300 votes or so. It didn't matter. Right? So when we begin to talk about urban indigenous peoples, urban indigenous residents, urban indigenous communities, it challenges people's understanding of who we are. In Ontario, 80% of us live in urban environments. Nationally, more than 60% of us live in urban environments. In the United States, 80% of us live in urban environments. In Australia and New Zealand, 80% of us live in urban environments. So we're no longer the people that Canadians believe that we are. We don't reside. But the official government policy is to focus upon self-government for land-based communities. But we don't have a land base. They made an exception in Newfoundland when they created the Halibu. They created the Halibu First Nation, which is a First Nation community that does not have a land base. So things may change. So when you talk about barriers, the fundamental barrier is one of attitude. We can find solutions to almost any societal problem, any societal issue that we want. But behind that desire for solution has to be an attitude that there is an Indigenous political community in urban centers. There is a Indigenous urban service community that can be highly effective and that is institutionally based. But it's somewhat fragile because it's all government supported. But when you begin to extend the conversation to self-government, then it begins to be a challenge, right, as well. Okay. We did a study in 3 prairie cities in Saskatoon, Regina, Winnipeg. And we asked them about urban Indigenous residents and how they began to incorporate us into the city, right? And what they said was that they were willing to change the names of streets, the names of parks, the names of buildings. But when it came to trying to build a place for us in the city government, they didn't know how to do that, or they were unwilling to do that. And so the other challenge is the lack of understanding by municipal leaders of how to go about creating good relationships, how to build us into the governing structure of the city, right, as well. And so it really is a challenge, right, beyond the Section 35 rights. Section 35 doesn't make any distinction about rights as opposed based upon geography, right? It just talks about Aboriginal peoples.
David, have you seen any examples where there is organizing in urban communities more along the lines of self-government? I know, as you've already mentioned, there are a lot of service-related organizations established in many towns and cities across the country. But what about more in the sort of along the lines of, are there glimmers of possibility, I guess is what I'm looking for?
I guess there are some glimmers of possibility, and some of them were started under the Urban Aboriginal Strategy, which brought together service organizations, right? And they created urban Aboriginal councils, right? And those were more expressions of self-determination than of self-governance, right, as well. And they only focused upon trying to provide advice to city councils, right, and municipalities, right, as well. But they were a nascent form of organizing. They were a nascent form of an expression of Indigenous self-determination. But they had no basis, right, in any legislation. They were not based upon any Indigenous or Aboriginal right? And so Some of them continued past the loss of funding for the urban Aboriginal strategy, but most of them have disappeared, and there's some attempt to bring them back on a voluntary basis, right? And so what you begin to see, I think, in urban environments is not so much governance or self-government based upon Section 35, but more a form of organizational governance that is based upon service delivery, right, as well.
So commonly the friendship centers in communities, I would imagine, are fairly focal point for some of this activity.
That's right. Friendship centers, the child welfare agencies, there are some schools now that exist, right, as well. Head Start programs. There are all sorts of organizations that now exist. Right? There are some cultural organizations as well, right, that exist.
On the other hand, we also see on reserves or increasingly self-governing nations, either through agreement or sort of asserting their own self-determination, reaching out to their urban members to include them in, sort of designing the future of their communities and self-government. Mm-hmm. Do you have any sort of comments on what you've seen there that's either working or not working in terms of representing urban Indigenous populations?
Remember that those reaching out still see the urban Indigenous residents as part of their communities, right? So in a sense, it's not a form of urban self-governance, right, as well. It's not urban Indigenous people coming together and making decisions about their own lives, their own institutions, their own programs, their own services, right, as well. And it's a way in which First Nations on reserve communities extend their jurisdiction. There have been some attempts to create urban reserves that are residential, but again, those are still seen as connected to a host First Nation, right, as well. In a sense, right, I mean, Corbière also required First Nations to reach out and to provide them with access or political rights and access to voting, right, as well. And so some of that is a result of that. And I know at Six Nations, where I come from, the council has never reached out to me. They know where I am, right? They've never reached out to me and asked if I want to vote in band elections at all. Granted, there are 30,000 of us, but and only about 15,000 live on reserve. So it's difficult for them to perhaps find the exact address for everyone as well.
So I guess the last question, and maybe it should have been the first one, is, in your view, does this matter ultimately? Is it important for urban Aboriginal people to be looking to organize around self-government and representation in the communities they're now living in?
I would say yes, and for the following reason. In 2010, I worked with Environics, and we did a survey of more than 2,000 urban Indigenous residents. We asked them about their experience in urban environments. And one question asked about where was home? And of that sample, 75% said the city was home. A similar number said similar percentage said that they had no intention of moving back to either a reserve, a rural, or a Métis community. That the city was home, the city was their future. And so when people talk about their place of residence as their home, then I think we have to pay attention and we have to begin to say, okay, how can you then begin to ensure that that home meets your needs and reflects your own desires, your own ideas about how to live together as well. And we asked another question in the survey about their level of engagement in the community. And what we found was a very high level of what we called civic engagement, that urban Indigenous residents were engaged to a higher degree than their mainstream counterparts. And they believed that they could shape the city to meet some of their needs, right, as well. And that they had a set of goals and objectives for the lives that they were trying to achieve and that they wanted to achieve in urban environments. And so Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, Native people, whatever term we use, right, living in cities is a permanent feature of urban life. It's not temporary. That Indigenous people are not refugees from reserves, which is what the early 60s and 70s research said, that we were running away from dysfunctional reserve communities. That's no longer the case, right? There are now urban Indigenous communities and institutions in most Canadian cities, right, as well. And they're permanent, right? And so we have to deal with that reality. When we released the results of the Environics study, our colleagues at the Assembly First Nations said that this was just mere opinion. Environics does opinion research, and it was just opinion, and they dismissed it. This is not real, right? But the reality is that those communities are growing and have grown over the last half century or so.
David, it sounds like we could devote an entire podcast series just to this issue, giving us an awful lot to think about and explore. Well, thank you very much for being willing to talk about it with us today.
Okay. And I'll continue to talk about it as well.
Thanks to everyone who shared their questions with us, and a special thanks to everyone who joined the program today and took the time to answer them for us. As the RFNG research project soon comes to a close, so too does our podcast. But we might surprise you with some special episodes between now and when our project ends in March 2027. We want to keep sharing our knowledge and tools for self-government so that it's available to others starting the journey to their inherent right to self-government when they're ready. If you enjoy the podcast, tell your friends, family, and co-workers. Let's not let a 9th generation grow up under the Indian Act. Inherent rights, informed voices, reclaiming our rights and ourselves.